All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first UCW Colorado seminar of 2021. So that intro music was played with permission from Monster Jack. You can find him on YouTube. It's a great channel. Anyway, today we have union member and CU Denver Professor Jim Walsh here to teach us about Colorado labor history. But first up, a few announcements. So this event was organized by our union's education committee. If you're a member of UCW, we are looking for more volunteers to work on a number of new projects. We're hosting monthly seminars now open to the public and will be recorded for YouTube and Facebook. We're organizing a Toastmaster style monthly public speaking group to help members improve their communication skills. We're doing movie screenings and trivia nights and also generating educational content for our union newsletter and social media pages. Right now we have a weekly book club and we're reading No Shortcuts by Jane McElvey. So if any of these projects or events interest you, just make sure to join the education and book club channels on Slack. We definitely need more volunteers to sustain all these projects. By the way, if you want to remember all this, feel free to take a screenshot of this slide or a screenshot of the next slide as well. So next up, make sure to mark your calendars for the next seminar, which is on February 24th. It's on privatization and austerity, delivered by our own UCW members, Perez and Hanalor. And we'll have a registration link up for that pretty soon. And the other quick announcement is that we have a union library. It's essentially a spreadsheet where members can share and borrow books from each other. Check it out, add to it, borrow from it. I'm not going to post a link here because it's a public event, but for union members, just feel free to message me on the Slack channel and I will send you all that info. So for upcoming events, our next general membership meeting is February 11th. The link is right there for you to sign up. I think Haley just put that in the chat as well, thanks. And then we'll have a film screening next month. It's 13th, which is an excellent documentary about racial inequality and the prison industrial complex. In support of our residence advisors, we're having a call-in day of action to demand that CU provide RAs with hazard pay and housing security, among other things. Sign up at the link in the slide for that. So I already mentioned the next seminar, that's going to be February 24th. And the last announcement is that our housing subcommittee meeting, that's a new subcommittee. The next meeting is going to be on February 12th. So just make sure to pay attention to Slack for those updates. So now on to the main event. I'm very excited to announce Dr. Jim Walsh, Professor of Political Science at CU Denver. His expertise includes labor and immigration history, US social movements, and community organizing. He's the founder of the Romero Theater Troupe, a community theater that uses the stage as a tool for popular education. He is a proud UCW member and is also an organizer with the Colorado Labor Education Collective. Jim is going to give us an overview of the rich history of Colorado labor movements, and we'll have time for Q&A and discussion after the talk. But if you do want to ask a question during the talk, please just use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and Jim or I will call on you, and then you can ask your question. Other than that, just please keep your mics on mute, and without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Jim.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I want to thank everyone at UCW who organized this. It's an honor to be able to address everyone, and it's great that we have such a big group. It's great that there's so much interest in labor history. So yeah, a little bit about myself. I'm from Western Pennsylvania originally, and a steel town called Butler. And what got me out of Butler, which is, believe me, deep red Trump country, is the sport of wrestling. And I've got a wrestling scholarship to Duke University. And I had no idea the wealth and privilege I was going to land in when I went to Durham, North Carolina. But that was my first experience with class consciousness. And I think that's planted a seed in me that became a labor historian, really, on the back of that experience. So I want to say a couple of things, and then we're going to get started in this journey. I've started this thing called the Colorado Labor Education Collaborative, and maybe we want to actually coordinate our monthly meetings, events, because that's really what we're going to be doing, is having a monthly event. So we'll figure out a way to do that. We'll have a website eventually too. And I want to give a quick plug. I don't know if I can share my screen yet. I can't. So Haley, if you could co-host me, or whoever has that. A quick plug, we have a labor program now in my department, political science department at CU Denver, through the New Directions program. And so before I get started, I just want to give a quick plug for that. Here's a flyer. We have both an undergraduate certificate program and also an MA in labor leadership. So these classes some of them are taught by academics, and some of them are taught by folks who have been organizing in the field for many, many years. So yeah, everyone. So if you have any interest, it would be great to, here's a little bit more information about this, give you an idea. One of the things we do, we have some scholarship funds. The program's about a year old. It was started by Min Sun Ji. She founded El Centro Humanitario about 17 years ago, and she started this about a year ago. So we're excited to strengthen it and keep it going. We have some scholarship money, so if unions can cover about half the tuition of a union member, we have enough scholarship funds to cover the other half. That's kind of how we see this operating. And the courses are both labor history and labor theory, but they're also hands-on courses about collective bargaining, about corporate research, issues like that. So we're trying to mix those two tool-based courses versus theory-based courses together. And actually the director of the program's with us. Steve, do you want to say a quick word, introduce yourself before I dive into the labor history here? Steve Del Castillo.
Okay, and there, can you hear me, everybody? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim. Hi, I'm Steve Del Castillo, and I'm the director of the New Directions. It's a Center for New Directions for Politics and Public Policy. And as Professor Walsh says, it's really a practical certificate and degree. And it really does focus on, as Professor Walsh said, both theory as well as practice. And practice means that everything from doing an internship to doing papers that are really practical in nature. We have a lot of, as a matter of fact, activities. Papers are going to be written and projects and theses that are being written right now that are very practical in nature. So would interest you, if you're interested, you can contact me at, you can see my name, Steve Del Castillo, at, Steve.Del Castillo, I should know my own email, at ucdenver.edu. So I'd be more than happy to set up a time to talk, send you information, and just kind of share with you where we're going with the program. So thank you, Jim.
Yeah, thanks so much, Steve. All right, friends, let's have a walk together through this amazing journey. I'm going to go through this rather quickly. The reason is that I really want to get to the dialogue. I want to have a conversation. I think that's always the funnest part of this. So this is going to be pretty fast and furious. There's not really a grand narrative to understanding Colorado labor history, so I don't have one. What I do have are bits and pieces of stories that I'm gonna piece together, string together for you, and this will certainly be an incomplete history. In other words, there's a lot that I'm not even going to touch upon tonight. These are stories I've learned over the course of 3 decades in Colorado, teaching labor history and learning it from people who have lived it. I know there's a lot of expertise in this virtual room, so at the end of the presentation, I want to learn from you and hear from you about what you know about, or something more about something I only touched upon in an incomplete way. So, so here we go, friends. it's I think appropriate to begin the history of labor history of the working class in cemeteries. So I'm gonna introduce you to a couple of cemeteries in Colorado, and then we're gonna go from there in a much deeper way. This cemetery is in Canyon City, in the corner of the historic cemetery. All of the little metal plates, you can see there's a few headstones, but all of the little metal plates that you see here all have this written on them: CSP inmate, Colorado State Penitentiary inmate. And that's it. So this is labor history as well. This is working class history. And one of the projects I'm going to be taking up after I finish my work in Leadville is to name the people buried here. The next cemetery I want to introduce you to, and by the way, just give me a thumbs up. The slides are changing for you, is that right? Okay. When I teach my classes, sometimes the slides change for me, but they don't change for my students. And I'm going on, and they have a quizzical look on their face. The second cemetery I want to introduce you to is in Leadville. This is in the Evergreen Cemetery in Leadville. It's in the back of the cemetery. It's in the pauper section. This is called the Catholic Frieze section. And what you see here is sunken, unmarked graves that stretch for acres. There are somewhere close to 2,000 just in the Catholic section. And when you walk through the forest, you see rows and rows of holes, some of which have wooden slabs that were put. Those were the only markers, and they've since rotted and fallen down. The average age of the people buried in these sunken graves is 23. And 48%, nearly half, are 12 years or younger. 9% are listed as stillborn, almost 1 in 10. So the work that I've been doing over the past several years is digging up records to name the unnamed. Most of them are immigrants, mostly from Ireland, but from many other places as well. And they died young. They were worked to death without health care at 10,000 feet. So we're building a memorial in the cemetery. We've raised a lot of money, and all the names are going to go on the memorial. So this, I believe, is the work of historians, but it's the work of non-historians as well. This is reaching back into history in the same way that we want to reach into the future. A census list of a railroad gang in rural Colorado in 1880. You can see all the different places that they come from: Mexico, Canada, Ireland, Sweden, France, Germany, and the ages. And these railroad gangs come up in the census in 1870 and 1880 and 1900 in the middle of nowhere. We found 400 Irish railroad workers in a mountain pass between Antonito and the New Mexican border in 1880, building that historic railroad that tourists now take. So I'm sharing this because I think that this is really what labor history is in many ways, is just glimpses and fragments of data that we can glean off of primary sources, and we have to make up the rest. In 1880 in Leadville, in May, 5,000 miners walked out of the mines and brought the Colorado economy to a standstill. They declared that this man, 28-year-old Michael Mooney, was their leader. He's born in Dublin. They marched through Leadville in perfect silence, in military order, declaring their strike. The strike was completely peaceful. There wasn't a single act of violence, but the governor declared martial law and sent the Colorado National Guard to Leadville. The orders of the soldiers was to arrest striking miners on vagrancy laws and force them to build roads in chain gangs. And so the strike was crushed militarily. Mooney was an amazing leader. He kept the men focused. He kept them peaceful. He came to Denver to raise money. At 14th and Lawrence, he gave a big speech to the Working Men's Party and was arrested by Denver police after his speech. I like to tell this story to my students because often I'm teaching just on the other side of Spear from the location of that talk. But Mooney was released the next day because he hadn't committed a crime, and the police realized they couldn't hold him. He was threatened by vigilantes with lynching and was blacklisted. When the strike was crushed, he couldn't get work. So he eventually left with his family and fled to Seattle and Butte, Montana, and then eventually to Los Angeles. And this is really the story of miners in the 19th century, drifting, transient, particularly in my area of expertise is Irish miners, incredibly transient community, just drifting from mining camp to mining camp with a kind of a bare existence. Here's a photograph of mostly Irish miners on strike. You see the ribbons on their lapels. This was common. This was a custom from a secret society in Ireland of agrarian resistance called the Ribbon Men. And they brought these traditions of agrarian resistance from rural Ireland to the anthracite coal region of Pennsylvania, and then to Leadville. The Molly Maguires, which is an Irish secret society that emanated in rural Ireland that opposed cruel practices by landlords, sometimes violently, that tradition was brought to the mines of eastern Pennsylvania. And when a couple of mining superintendents were murdered, they blamed it on this shadowy organization called the Molly Maguires, and hanged 20 Irish immigrants were hanged in the coal fields. At the same time, Leadville was booming. So Irish miners poured into Leadville when they left Pennsylvania. That's one of the reasons that Leadville had such an enormous Irish community. This is just a speech Mooney gave when the strike started. Demanding a raise from $3 to $4 a day, an 8-hour day. They weren't asking for, this wasn't a big radical ask. They were asking for pretty basic stuff. Mentioning how they're living in high altitude, breathing in the bad air, and these miners died young. I mean, those unmarked graves hold the remains of so many miners who died young. There's a line in here that I just love toward the end. Now we have just come to this conclusion that if they can pull the reins, we can pull tighter. And we are determined to have our rights no matter what comes. There's something about that line that I just love. This is the hill where they met on. They didn't have an indoor meeting place, so they had to meet outside on hillsides. You can imagine in Leadville at 10,000 feet. So I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. This is my other favorite Mooney quote. And no one in Colorado has ever heard of this guy. I've been dressing up as him for 15 years. If anyone out there has been in my classes, you've seen me portray Michael Mooney. I don't know that the whole American flag covers me, but I think I have a corner. And what's the beauty of this quote is I think it captures in many ways the struggles of immigrant laborers in this country who worked for a corner of that flag, by God. And this is what Mooney was trying to say. And just to give you an idea of the mentality toward the Irish at this time, calling someone a Molly Maguire is like calling them a terrorist at that time. So the newspapers branded them all Molly Maguires to discredit their efforts. They're very sensational headlines. So I'm gonna keep moving now. I want to jump a little bit to what that last piece mentioned, which is a Chinese community. So in the American West, Chinese immigrants and Irish immigrants collided, looking for the same jobs: railroad work, mining work, domestic work, laundry businesses. So there was direct competition for the same work between these two immigrant communities. And many of you might know that in Denver in 1880, the Chinese community was essentially burned out by a mob on Halloween night of 1880. And what was called Hop Alley was between Wazee and Wynkoop Street in the alley, somewhat between Cherry Creek and what is now Coors Field. There were about 500 people. And that mob was largely an Irish mob. The Irish lived right in those areas. There was a Democratic Party rally that night in the lead up to the election. The streets were full of Irish immigrants. And so that's something that I think the Irish community needs to own, is that that was largely an Irish riot. And the Irish were a big part of the mob violence and vigilante violence that the Chinese community faced in the American West was Irish violence, which is ironic given that the Irish had sort of experienced some of that themselves, not nearly to the same degree. But this political cartoon, the great fear of the period that Uncle Sam may be swallowed by foreigners, depicts the nativism that these two groups faced. And then at the end, the Chinese man swallows the Irish man, and that's the problem solved. So this is a newspaper depiction of the mob destroying Chinatown. There's a plaque about this in downtown Denver, and there's an effort right now to change the plaque because the plaque focuses on white people that sort of help the Chinese community instead of focusing on the Chinese community. And so that's a really important effort that's taking place right now. My colleague William Wise sort of leading that. But this happened, Rock Springs, Wyoming, close to 30 people, Chinese immigrants, were murdered by a mob. Almost every major city and mining camp in the American West. In Leadville, it didn't happen because in Leadville, the Chinese were banned from living in Leadville. When a Chinese immigrant tried to move to Leadville, they were met with violence. And this is a labor, the Working Men's Party of California. This is a union putting out this racist literature. So unions were caught up in this. Labor was caught up in this xenophobia for sure. This is called the Western Statue of Liberty. So I'm gonna keep moving quickly, everyone. So anything you want to talk about later, make a note of it because this is gonna go fast. This is a wonderful newspaper account of how Irish women, young women who worked as domestics, how they, I thought I had the wrong one, but yes, who work as domestics, negotiated and struggled for higher wages. And this is such a rare primary source to understand how this process happens. So a group of Irish women got off the train in Denver. They go to the Rocky Mountain News office because they've been recruited to come here. And they barge into the office and they're written about as if they noisily announced that they were just from Chicago. They were led here by Rocky Mountain News to the effect that 200 to 300 girls could readily find employment here and that they had walked all about town without being able to suit themselves. We said they were certainly mistaken as there was constant demand for female help, but they were irrepressible and determined to have the last word. And in course of the conversation, it became apparent that they were here expecting to get $8 or $10 per week and the usual privileges. More of the same kind arrived by last night's train, and now the news would gently hint to these ladies that they had better accept the first reasonably good offers that present themselves. 2 agents have gone from Denver to Chicago to engage girls for Denver. They carry lists of housekeepers who agree to employ so many and of such a description, and it is expected the bill will be filled according to order. The reign of $10 to $12 per week kitchen tyrants who have domineered over and marred the peace of comfort of the Denver households for a dozen years has about come to an end. So you can get very clearly the attitude of when these immigrant domestics had the audacity to ask for a higher wage, how that was taken. So the reason this is important is it gives us a little bit of the voice of these young women, mostly immigrants from Ireland, who are, because they don't have a union, who are fighting and figuring out ways to demand better wages. I'm gonna sort of keep going here. I want to talk about another strike in Leadville. So the first strike I just told you about was one of the first massive strikes in our state's history in 1880. And that was the Knights of Labor. Some of you that know US labor history know that the Knights were quite progressive for their time. And they were one of the first national labor unions in the country. So Michael Mooney's strike was the Knights of Labor. 16 years later, there was another strike in Leadville in 1896. This strike was led by the Western Federation of Miners. The Western Federation of Miners were quite radical. And 2 years before the Leadville strike in 1894, there was a WFM strike in Cripple Creek, Victor. So Cripple Creek and Victor was also a very heavily Irish place. And that strike in 1894 in Cripple Creek, we had a very progressive populist governor, Governor Waite in Colorado, and he sent the Colorado National Guard to Cripple Creek to protect the miners from the hired guns that the company had brought in to crush their effort. And that, as far as I know and anyone else I've talked to, is the only time that soldiers have ever been sent into a labor dispute on the side of striking workers. It happened in 1894 in Cripple Creek. That's an important moment, everyone, in Colorado labor history, even though the strike didn't go as well as they had hoped. So that strike in Cripple Creek in 1894 with a populist governor. In 1896, the Western Federation of Miners struck in Leadville. And that strike, this time they were ready. They were ready. They had resources. They had a wide network in the Western Federation of Miners to support the strike. What happened in 1896 is the companies brought in replacement workers, scabs, and they reopened several mines that were in the Irish community on the east side. One being the Coronado mine, one being the Robert Emmett mine. Think about that. Robert Emmett's an Irish patriot. And they're reopening that mine named after him with scab labor. The Irish were so incensed about this. So a splinter group off of the Union decided that the only recourse they had was to meet violence with violence. So they named themselves the Regulators, and they organized to attack these mines that had been reopened with scab labor. The replacement miners were living in the mines because they were terrified to leave the mines. They would live in the mines. The problem, so about 50 guys armed themselves. In the middle of the night, they attacked the Coronado mine on East 7th Street in Leadville. But the problem was that the Union was infiltrated. This is an old story, isn't it? The Union had been infiltrated. They knew the attack was coming. The guards were ready, and it was a bloodbath. Officially, the death toll was 6 of the attackers, including a fireman who was trying to put out the fire and was shot in the back. But the newspapers make mention that rumors had it that up to 24 people were killed that night, and they were hastily buried next to the railroad tracks on the east side of Leadville. So this is a newspaper account of Irish women and children blocking the road from the guards escorting the scabs up to the mines. And they called the guards who on their horsebacks, they called them camelback scab herding sons of bitches. I thought that was the term of the night. So there you go, everyone. Colorado National Guard, camelback scab herding sons of bitches. I'm going to divert from mining for just a minute because there's so much to touch upon. Sorry, I have a little bit of a frog in my throat. Most of you know that Denver's historic African-American community is 5 Points, and the gentrification that's taken place there over the last 30 years has really changed the community. But the history of that community is really important. The labor history of that community is super important. It's close to the railroad tracks. And that's one of the reasons for that is that many men from southern states, from Confederate states and from northern states, but I believe mostly from southern states, made their way west on the railroads and found work as porters, Pullman porters. And so in Denver's early Black community, many of the families and many of the men who sort of were the first to live in this community, the work that they had was working as Pullman porters. And this was part of the Great Migration out of the South in the years following the war, mostly up into the industrial Midwest, but many people made their way out west. And by the way, there was an African-American agricultural community about 20 miles east of Greeley called Deerfield. And if you've never heard of Deerfield, it's a ghost town today, but you can go up there and still see the Historical Society has preserved some of the buildings. And at one point, Deerfield had about 400 people around the time of World War I. So this is an important part of, and of course, A. Philip Randolph eventually organized these Pullman porters. So this was part of that labor history as well. This is a photo from the second strike in Leadville. These are the National Guardsmen after they set up camp. And a ribbon, remember the ribbons that they wore in their lapel? A woman I met in Leadville randomly gave me this ribbon. So I have this, and this is it says Cloud City Miners Union, number 33, Leadville, Colorado. One of the reasons I learned so much about this strike is the spies that the company hired to infiltrate the union kept detailed records. And there's about 1,000 pages of these records at the Historical Society. And these are just tiny excerpts to give you an idea of what these sounded like. They tried to, the strategies of the labor spies were really clear. They tried to play ethnic groups against each other. They made whispering campaigns. They would whisper things to the Irish that they can't trust the Cornish, and they definitely can't trust the Swedes. And by the way, the Finns that are plotting against them, and they used this to divide people, but it was somewhat effective. They also, tried to understand and identify the people who were thinking about becoming violent. So this just gives you a flavor for what these documents are like. They're fun to read, but you have to read them with a lens of understanding that they're written through the eyes of these spies, and they're also written for the employers of the spies. The spies are good at telling the employers what they want to hear. So it's hard to wade through all this and get to what is truth. So I'm going to then skip to some other stuff. So I want to jump to coal mining. So there was a segregation in mining in this state in the late 19th and early 20th century. The segregation was hard rock mining was largely done by Northern and Western Europeans, Irish, Cornish, Welsh, English, Scottish, German, French, Scandinavian. Coal mining was largely done by Eastern Europeans and by people from Latin America, Mexico and Latin America. So there was a distinct segregation there. Coal miners made less, and coal mining was more dangerous. So Colorado's coal mining history is in two parts of the state. Southern Colorado, Walsenburg, Trinidad area, and then what were called the Northern Fields, Boulder, Erie, Lafayette area. And these are just images of child labor. These were called breaker boys, young between 6 and 10 who worked separating the coal from the slate when it came through the chutes. So I'm sure all of you have heard of Ludlow, so I don't want to get into the weeds with Ludlow, but just to kind of touch upon it. the tents were shipped out here from Union members back east, and the strikers were simply, this was the Southern Fields. They were simply asking for better pay, for the right to form a union, for the right to elect their own weighman, the person who weighs the coal when it comes out of the mines, because a lot of times there was corruption and they would underweigh it. Not to be paid in script, but to be paid in actual money, and on and on. And so they set up a tent colony. The tent colony is largely halfway between Walsenburg and Trinidad today. Most of you have been there. So again, the same thing. Why does this story repeat itself so often? The Colorado National Guard is called in. Many of these soldiers are hardened soldiers from the insurrection in the Philippines that took place. It's one of the bloodiest wars that's never been written about much. And they were told these weren't poor miners looking for a better shake. They were dangerous Bolsheviks. And so tensions rose. The miners had dug some pits under the tents where people could hide and where they could store things. And on the day of the attack, women and children were in one of those pits, mostly children. And the tent above it was burned. They poured kerosene on the tents and burned them. And the women and children suffocated. I think there were something like 13 children and 2 or 3 women. This led the miners armed themselves, declared war on the state of Colorado, and a civil war took place that went on for months. And so this is an idea of what this looked like. They lived through an entire winter in these tents, and 20 languages were spoken in this camp. So they figured it out. They overcame a lot of the cultural and ethnic divisions. You can get a sense of how much snow. That was a pretty snowy winter. And this was the aftermath. The woman on the right is Mother Mary Jones, another icon. She was arrested before the massacre, imprisoned in Trinidad. 500 women marched in the streets of Trinidad demanding she be released. She was banned from the state and deported. This was another tactic, everyone, to break organizing efforts. It was called deportations. They would put union leaders on trains and send them to Western Kansas or Central New Mexico and simply leave them in the desert with orders never to return to Colorado. And that was a pretty common tactic, which I've found was used around the turn of the century quite often. It was used against the Wobblies in a big time way. The IWW faced these kinds of deportations. So Mother Jones, I think I'd like to see her statue in the front of the west steps of the Capitol. What do you guys think? Yeah, but most of her work was back east, but she did a fair amount of work out here as well. She said, the judge asked her once what her address was. She said, "My address is like my shoes. It travels with me wherever there's injustice." Here's the miners after the massacre. They armed themselves and they went to war. Can't blame them for that. In that situation, they felt they had no recourse. And there's the pit where the people died, the children. And this is Mother Jones in one of her marches. And here we are now that Civil War statue is down. And there's some of the miners marching up the Capitol, west steps of the Capitol. I want to mention some people you may have never heard of in Colorado history. This is Ben Salmon. Ben Salmon was a conscientious objector in World War I. He was inspired by Ludlow. The injustice of Ludlow brought him into activism in a new way, and he was very much about workers' rights. He refused to serve in World War I. he was imprisoned, tortured. And when he went on a hunger strike, he was force fed for 130 days. And there's now an effort to push for sainthood. He was very much devout Roman Catholic. And there's an effort within the church to push for sainthood. And Ben Salmon, guess where he lived? If you know where the McDonald's is at Irving and 38th, he lives right across the street. So he's a Denver native, North Denver. And his daughter, she's 90-some-year-old nun in the Mary Knoll order in New York, is still doing the work of peace work that her father championed. He couldn't even return to Denver after the war because the Knights of Columbus banned him. He might have been murdered by vigilantes if he had come back to Denver. That's what he faced with his family. So he lived the rest of his life in Chicago. In 1920, the tramway workers in Denver struck. There had been an effort to the city tried to raise fares because they needed more revenue, and the company protested. And what happened is the company tried to cut the salaries of the workers to compensate for this kind of back and forth tug of war with the city. And when they tried to cut the pay of the workers, they struck. The tramway workers struck in Denver. The company hired hundreds of, I don't know how else to, what other term to use, just armed thugs from California, and brought them here to intimidate the strikers. And they tried to get the cars going during the strike. So what the workers would do is they would push the cars over anytime they tried to do this. This is in front of the Immaculate Cathedral on East Colfax. You could recognize the church there in the background. These strike breakers were not messing around. They were professionals, and 6 or 7 people were killed during this strike. All of them innocent bystanders who were just caught up in shootouts, and up to 30 or 50 people were seriously injured. This was a bloody strike, even though it only lasted for, I think, a couple of weeks. This was a bloody strike, and this was in 1920. These strike breakers were vicious in the way that they went about their business, and most of the people in Denver turned on them and supported the strikers because of it. I want to say a word about the importance of sugar beet fields and sugar beet workers. So in the South Platte Valley and the Arkansas Valley, sugar beets were a huge cash crop in Colorado, and immigrant workers from so a lot of the workers were what were called German Russians, Volga-Deutsch, who came from Europe and worked many of these fields, also from Mexico, and also from northern New Mexico. And so many of these sugar beet field workers worked in the summers in the beet fields, and then in the winters they went and worked in the coal mines near Walsenburg and Trinidad. And the IWW organizers recognized that when they organized coal miners, they had to go into the beet fields and organize workers there as well. And that was a great strategy that they used. Remember that most of the IWW leadership were immigrants, either from Mexico or Eastern Europe. So I can't think of a union that was more keyed into bringing people together across racial and cultural lines, and also recognizing the unique struggles of immigrant workers in the IWW. And in 1927, the IWW organized all of the coal miners in Colorado to strike. And the southern Colorado, all the miners went out, and most of them in northern Colorado as well. That strike lasted about 10 months. And that was a bloody strike because of the strike breakers who were brought in. You know, it's always interesting how striking workers are always labeled as violent. But most of the violence, and if you really look at labor history, the violence is usually coming from the other side, whether it's through strike breakers, hired guns, or military. And that's what happened with this 1927 strike. Is these hired guns were brought in, state police as well. Remember that state police were, the origins of state police were as strike breaking units. That's in many ways why they were created. And so that strike the IWW led strike was an amazing effort, but it couldn't outlast the coal industry. By the way, there was a massacre of miners during that 1927 IWW strike near Lafayette, the Columbine mine. Some call this the first Columbine massacre. I think 6 of the strikers were killed, something like that. And there's a memorial to them near the library in Lafayette. So so you're learning about more of these kind of massacres of miners beyond just Ludlow. Here's a picture of the deportation of Wobblies. They're all being marched to be shipped away. I don't think this picture's from Colorado. I think this might be Arizona. And here's a cartoon depicting a German soldier with IWW, you know, as a way to sort of demonize the Wobblies. But the Wobblies were bold, man. They had tactics. they in Pueblo, they would just meet outside, because every time they tried to meet inside a facility, that owner of that place the law would come down on that owner pretty hard and ostracize them. So they just started meeting outside. You're loading the men on trains to deport them. This is the famous deportation in Bisbee. There's a film about this. I encourage you guys to see if you haven't seen that film about the Wobs in Bisbee, Arizona. I want to say something about the Klan, because it's just important to keep in mind that during the early 20s, the Klan ran this state. The Klan, in part, aside from being racist and anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic, the Klan was also very much against workers organizing. It was very anti-labor focus and mission, and that was part of what they did, is try to keep labor weak. This photo's from 17th Street in downtown Denver. I'm sure most of you know that the KKK ran our state between about 1900 and 1920. I'm sorry, 1920 and 1925, until there was a big scandal that sort of broke that up. Sacco and Vanzetti, I'm gonna keep going because I still have a little bit to cover. so forgive me for kind of. This is a photo of the hall, and I think this is in Walsenburg during the 1927 Wobbly strike. And this is what the vigilantes and the strike breakers did to the Wobbly office in Walsenburg. They kind of shot it up, and there were deaths 1 at a time, 2 at a time down there. I don't know a lot of the details about it, but just in essentially attempts to intimidate and scare people from striking. This is Flamin' Mamie, 19 years old. She was thought to be fearless during that Wobbly strike. She became a leader of the union in the effort. And she eventually went to a labor school in the Midwest somewhere and did some other work around the country, sort of a young version of Mother Jones, I think you would think of her as. And another jump to the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, there was a demonization of and a scapegoating of immigrant labor and of Okie labor from Oklahoma and Kansas. So I don't know if you all know this, but in 1936, Governor Johnson declared martial law. A lot of martial law in Colorado history. It's always directed toward working people. Declared martial law and sent the National Guard to the Colorado-New Mexico border. Their orders were to stop anyone who looked Mexican or pauper from entering the state. The martial law only lasted about 11 days because it became clear that it was unconstitutional. But this was in a time of extreme xenophobia, targeting, migrant workers, whether they were coming from the Great Plains or whether they were coming from New Mexico or Mexico. Oh, there you go. There's a great photo of this. No machines with lugs permitted on this road. That's a great sign. So the Bracero program impacted Colorado. This was starting in the 40s during the war, extending into the 60s. This was a guest worker program, bringing tens of thousands of young men, mostly young men from Mexico, across the Southwest to do agricultural work, railroad work, mining, the most dangerous and difficult work. These young men were subjected to being sprayed down with what we would today consider to be incredibly toxic and dangerous chemicals. I don't think it was DDT. I'm trying to remember. And then the Braceros really didn't have any recourse. If they ended up in a situation where they were being treated cruelly or abused, they really didn't have recourse. So the stories of the Braceros are amazing stories, and many hundreds of them worked up in Colorado. I'm gonna move into maybe some of the farm worker stuff. This is Dolores Huerta. She's still doing this work. I mean, it's incredible what she's done in her life. She didn't get as much credit as Cesar Chavez, although she was really the brains behind so much of this work. But in Colorado, most of you know about Cesar Chavez and the farm workers in California, but in Colorado, there was lettuce strike. There was a march from Pueblo to Denver that took place. So there was a lot of activity among farm workers here in Colorado that was happening in unity with the efforts in California. And this is also happening at the same time as the Crusade for Justice, the sort of urban wing of the Chicano movement. And I want to emphasize that labor was a part of what the Crusade did. You can see here on this brochure, it says unions on the right side. The Crusade for Justice was very much a working class organization. The vast majority of people in the Crusade were from working class backgrounds. And they were very tuned into class as well as culture and race. It was very much about class. And police brutality was, of course, is still such a big issue. I want to just mention this is one of the most amazing stories you'll ever hear in Colorado. Su Teatro did a performance about this recently, and the Romero troupe, my theater group, we performed this about 5 or 6 years ago. The floral workers in Fort Lupton area faced incredibly difficult working conditions and harassment. Most of the workers were women. They faced a lot of sexual harassment, very dangerous working conditions, stood in water all day. They went on strike. Floral workers in 1969, I think it was. The strike lasted, I think, 7 months. The men all quit. It was just, for the most part, all women. And what they realized they couldn't win. They were just up against too much. So in one last act of defiance, they chained themselves to the company fence. And Weld County sheriffs tear gassed them at close range. The leader of this strike was Guadalupe Briceño. I was so lucky to meet her. And when we performed this story, she played herself on stage, chaining herself. And it was, I'll never forget that. It's because to me, I really saw her in such a heroic way. So this is in the Fort Lupton area. I think that's Lupe in the middle. And there she is in a more recent photo. And I want to get close to finishing up here, but I want to make mention of some intersectionality here. I was given these photos by an activist when the Romero troupe told a story on stage about a Denver police murder of a man who identified as drag queen in 1978. And his murder was followed by people taking to the streets and marching. And one of the banners at that march said "Workers' World Unity." It was a sort of a conglomeration of socialists and some WOBs and some other labor radicals. And I just think that's so important to see. This is 1978 that we see that intersectionality between labor and LGBTQ rights in 1978 in Denver, the streets of Denver. When I show this to my students, I can't believe it's 1978 that people were out in the streets at that time. But of course, Denver has a long and proud history in gay rights, trans rights movement. This is just a photo from the raid on the Greeley Swift plant that happened about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when hundreds of workers in that meatpacking plant in Greeley were deported to Central America and elsewhere, and the way it was done as well. And I'll just kind of end by emphasizing, that the working class in Colorado has, to a large degree, always been immigrants. And the immigrant rights struggle today is workers' rights struggle. You can't separate the two. They're the same struggle in so many ways. And what we call essential workers today. And I also want to just mention how mass incarceration is a class issue, is a labor issue, is an economic justice issue. And the disparities we see with numbers of African-American men, particularly men, and women in prison. This is a 15 or 20-year-old Rocky Mountain News article about those disparities. This is it's the beginning of when that conversation about these disparities started taking place. So I just think I want to mention that. I'm going to end with one of my heroes who just passed away, Rita Martinez. Rita Martinez started the anti-Columbus Day movement in Pueblo 27 years ago. 27 years ago. The Columbus statue still stands in Pueblo. But every year, she would hold a rally. And when Black Lives Matters inspired her this summer, she made it a weekly rally instead of an annual rally, and did it all summer and fall. And she passed away from COVID about 2 months ago. These are the people whose shoulders we stand on, friends. I'm going to end there because I want to hear some of your voices, and I just want to make this into a conversation, and I want to shut up. So thanks, everybody. So maybe the way to do this would just be to put your hand up, or electronic hand up, and I guess I can just call on people, and we can kind of go from there. So I can't see everybody. That's the problem. So I see a couple of hands. Peter, why don't you start, and then Prakriti. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. You could be next after that. Go ahead.
Hey everybody, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'm helping out with Denver Health Workers United. I was wondering what kind of information you have on healthcare workers and unions in Colorado.
Yeah, there might be somebody in our group tonight who knows more about that than I do. I know from what I know, it's a much more recent labor history with healthcare workers in our state, but I'm afraid I can't give you a lot of details more beyond that. Does anyone want to speak to that? Sorry.
No, I appreciate it. We'll just do our own history. We'll just start it now and like blow it up.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's so much that's the problem. You can't. Is that you have to leave so much out, Prakriti, do you want to be next?
Hi. Sorry, I I can't put my hand down now. Anyway, I was so when you were talking about the Irish minors and the Chinese like the Irish and the Chinese immigrants fighting each other, and you said that it was ironic. But I was just to me, it seems like that the reason they were fighting was because they were undergoing so much of the same experience. And like it's a symptom of their oppression that they were pitted against each other. And that it isn't all that ironic considering the circumstances these two communities were put in, but like an immediate, response to that. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I really agree with your analysis, and there's a great book that sort of captures that. It's called has anyone read How the Irish Became White? And it's sort of this
yeah. Heard of it. I haven't read it, but I've heard of the book.
Yeah, it's an exploration of this kind of entry into whiteness for Irish immigrants, and the deal was that they then were used as to do the heavy work against communities of color like Chinese immigrants. So thank you for your thought. Yeah. Adam?
Yeah, you had said if there was something you said that was interesting that we write it down. Could you elaborate a little bit more on the origins of the state police kind of being formed as a labor busting unit?
Yeah, I think there's some good literature out there about this. And I can't give you, Adam, a lot of details. I just know that I've come across it, a few references to this in all my labor history reading, that the origins of state police forces were really to put down strikers. Because remember after Ludlow, there's laws being put into place where you can't use the military anymore. And so coming up with state police forces as a replacement for that dirty work, if that makes sense. And yeah, which is, it's kind of cast state police in a whole different light to know that history, I think. Bharath, and then Jeff, and then Steve.
I'm actually just holding the place for Perez, who has some tech issues. So Perez, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Bharath. Yeah, I'm running Linux, so maybe the Zoom client's weird. But yeah, I was pretty curious to hear about the religious parts of the labor movement. You mentioned quite a few Catholics, and yeah, I come from a Catholic family. I'm Catholic myself, and I'm very curious about that.
Well, I don't think Catholics are somehow more prone to form unions. In fact, the Catholic Church stood against unions. Mm-hmm. Was very much anti-union. In Leadville, they tried to stop the workers from organizing. And they were very much against the Knights of Labor. Because Knights of Labor had a sort of a pseudo-religious initiation ritual, and the Catholic Church was very threatened. They felt like these unions were taking their members away from them. So, so these workers were not just fighting the companies, they were also fighting their own church. But in Leadville, most of the workers were Catholic because of the huge Irish community. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Perez?
Yeah, that does. I was curious about the conflict between their religion and the church. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jeff.
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm always curious about labor history in Colorado, having been a labor organizer now for a dozen years. I'm curious about where we see the interface between like the state police, which has actually a union, and the interface between public employees and the public. Because both of these people are represented now. How do we support their efforts broadly?
Jeff, the only piece I didn't get, because your audio broke up a little bit, were which two people or groups you're talking about.
Oh, okay. Well, let me lean into this. I'm going to get a new camera. State police have actually a union. Mm-hmm. The state employees now have a union. How do those interface with each other?
You mean state police and unions?
Yeah.
Well, we've all, but maybe not all, but we've been focused now on you know, the downside of police unions is that police unions are supporting structures that lead to the brutality of communities of color. And that's a problem. And that's a problem that the labor community needs to figure out and solve. And I'm, you know, state police unions that face similar, I think prison worker unions as well face similar sort of conundrums as well. So I think that's a conversation that's happening in the labor community, and who knows what the outcome will be, but I'm hopeful there's a solution to that. But yeah, thanks for raising it. I wish I had a more thorough answer. So
we'll continue the conversation, I'm sure.
Okay, Steve, and then Shane.
Yeah, Jim, curious in the work that you've done over the last, and covering the history for the last 150 plus years, have you seen any kind of broad themes or across the labor issues and the labor movements in Colorado, beginning way in the 1850s all the way to contemporary times?
Violence is one for sure. Almost all the strikes I talk about were met with violence. The workers were met with violence. I think another is overcoming cultural and ethnic barriers. And the greatest example of success in that would be the Ludlow strike. But in most of the other strikes, there was not a lot of success with that. But something in the IWW just figured that out. I have never read about a more successful strategy than the IWW. They just had that figured out, how to bring people together across those boundaries and those lines. So those are the two that stand out to me. You know.
Okay.
And I also want to say, you know, often when we talk about labor history, we tend to focus on male workers. Mm-hmm. But in all of these strikes, women are playing huge roles. In fact, they're often the ones out front, being the subject of taking the brunt of the violence. In all the strikes that I talked about, women were out front, right next to the bayonets and the picket lines. So that's not something that's been explored, I think, enough. So thanks for that. Shane?
Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a lot of history in Colorado I wasn't aware of. Do you have any book recommendations, broadly speaking, on Colorado labor history?
There's not. This is a seed in my head. I want to write the first comprehensive Colorado labor history book. So maybe you can maybe you'll beat me to it, Shane. But there's just several that touch upon a lot of this stuff. Ernesto V. Hill's book on the Crusade for Justice is not a labor history, but it's very much a working class history. And it's very important. I think that's the most important book to understanding Denver that I've ever read, is The Crusade for Justice by Ernesto V. Hill. You know, there's been several books written about Ludlow. My book, which is hopefully come out next year, about Leadville, will be another contribution. But there's just here and there community histories. There's just but nothing comprehensive. As you all know, labor history is always left out. It's just always left out. I mean, I always ask my freshmen to raise their hand if they had any labor history in high school. And out of 50 students, I might get 2 hands in the air. So we have a lot of work to do. Thanks for that, Shane. Lauren?
Hi, Jim. Thank you so much for being here. This has been wonderful to learn. And on broader topics, I'm kind of curious I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the relationship between labor history and also like the United States participation in, like, I suppose, origins in settler colonialism. I mean, those are kind of big things, but my head's trying to see where those connect and how they relate to each other.
No, I think there's a huge connection there. Back to that theme of how the Irish became white. It was like a Faustian bargain, you know, that you can be brought into the whiteness club, but you have to be the soldiers to go out and put down indigenous uprisings, and you have to be the police that brutalize communities of color. So there's definitely that. I also just want to make mention that during the Cold War, mainstream labor participated and supported a lot of the U.S. government efforts abroad to repress radical labor movements. In other words, bought into the idea of the whole containment of communism abroad. So labor is susceptible to being compromised in so many ways, and that's, I think, the big lesson of labor history is how easy that has tended to happen. You know, I hope that gets to the heart of your question.
Yeah, and that brings in things I hadn't even considered. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Bharat, did you have another question?
So we're coming up on 75 minutes. I just wanted to, I mean, we can keep this going as long as people are available. I just wanted to let everyone know that we're very happy to have had Professor Walsh here today. It was a great talk. I won't have like a formal closing, so we'll just keep this discussion going until the end. I just wanted to get everyone's quick attention to what Alex had just put in the chat. It's the statement from UCW regarding police unions and the AFL-CIO. That's going back to one of the topics we just discussed a few minutes ago. And I'm also putting a couple links in the chat for a feedback form for this event and for the call-in day of action for our RAs on campus. That's a big issue that UCW is working on. So if you're interested in helping out, you can check out that link. But yeah, that's all. It's a great discussion. Let's keep it going. And thank you again, Professor Walsh. It's really good.
Yeah. I see one more hand, Marty, and maybe we can, and then Colette, did you have your hand up? So we can do two more and wrap it up after that.
Hey, Jim, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. So you've been with the University of Colorado for a number of years and probably other institutions of higher learning. So what are your thoughts about the role or the practices of either pro or anti-labor practices of the University of Colorado?
Yeah, there's not a lot of pro there I can comment on. You know, I'm really pleased to see this organizing happening. UCW, it's just huge and so important. I remember years ago there was an effort to organize adjunct instructors. We had we participated in National Adjunct Walkout Day. But you know, I'll speak for academic colleagues. Many of my colleagues would wince at the word union, considering something like that beneath them. Does that make sense, everyone? The idea that union is for people who do manual labor, not for you know, academics with letters beside their names. So I'm so happy that this is happening, and hopefully it'll, you know, I think it'll lead to, it has a potential because it's really inclusive to all workers in our campuses. It has potential to be huge. So I'm really in awe of the folks I've gotten to know, Haley and Bharat, and everyone that I've gotten to know within Alex. You guys are rocking it, man. I can't believe it. So anyway, there's a couple more. Colette, go ahead, and then maybe Maddie after Colette.
Yeah, thanks. For some reason, I don't have the raise hand reaction emoji. Thank you, Jim. That was fantastic. As someone who just moved here a month ago, it's very, very helpful to get the Colorado labor history. In the march in the 1970s, in response to the drag queen being murdered, was that, it's Bottom said Workers' World Uniting. Was Workers' World in that march? And if so, has there been a long Workers' World history in Colorado?
Yeah, Workers' World was behind it, but I can't tell you more about the history. I've tried to connect with folks who might know more about that and shown them the photographs, but I still haven't been able to gather more information about it. You know, what's interesting is that when I study moments like that in Colorado history, almost all the time you see radical labor voices involved. And another example is in 1932, a group of young activists went to Wash Park because the swimming lake there was segregated. And dozens of young people of color, has anyone ever heard of this? Dozens of young people of color jumped into the lake. And on the other side of the lake was all the white swimmers. And they immediately got out of the lake and attacked the young activists with bricks and stones. And radical labor was a part of that organizing effort. So we see radical labor in all of these intersectional ways. And that inspires me, you know, that's so important. And I think that's why I love teaching labor history, is that when you teach labor history, it extends everywhere to all of these movements. So Maddie?
Yeah, I kind of have two questions. The first one is just, I noticed that Dennis Tillotman had a question in the chat, and I was also wondering about it. I've read recently that in the 70s to 80s, unions in the US became more nationalistic, with companies going international in search of cheaper labor. Has that affected Colorado?
It has, yeah, it definitely has. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment that has existed in unions is hindered organizing efforts and hindered solidarity. And I think for the most part, the labor community has overcome that, but there still are remnants of that. You know, seeing immigrant communities as the enemy. So yeah, but I guess I'll stop there, but I just think that's an ongoing challenge. It's not only to avoid embracing that sort of xenophobia, but also to avoid getting co-opted into this sort of nationalist mentality. I mean, you know, labor's beginning to, I believe, more of a global focus has been taking place over the past several decades, and that's where it has to move, as a global focus.
Okay,
Thanks for that question. Yeah. Peter?
Hey, I got one more question. I was wondering, what do you think, what do you think essential workers and union activists can learn from the workers of the past? Like, what do you think the biggest takeaway and lesson, from whether it be like their tenacity or the conditions they experienced or something they always kept in mind? Like, what would be the biggest takeaway from our ancestors?
Yeah, what do we take from this history? Great question to end on. How about this? All the strikes, all the organizing efforts, all the activism in this history, we tend to want to think about like a scorecard: wins and losses, W's and L's. But I don't think it matters whether they were wins or losses in the short term. I think what a knowledge of this history does is it helps us understand our place in this long trajectory, and that we are just the present link in this long movement. And I think that's inspiring, you know. So I don't really, when I study these strikes, I don't care if they're wins or losses. What I care about is that people had the courage to do what they did. And I find so much when I did. So history is like a nourishment for us. It's nourishment. Go back into the past and find out, what did people do in this similar situations? Like those floral workers in Fort Lupton that chained themselves. My God, you know. So anyway, there's a lot to be hopeful for, and I'm happy to be a part of this organizing effort, and I hope to see many of you again. You know what I want to do, everybody, is invite you to email me, because I want to put you on the email list for our Colorado Labor Education Collaborative, so that you can be you can know what events are coming up. We're going to be doing all kinds of different things, intersectional as well. So I would love to hear from you, so I can add you to that list. And if you're interested in launching your acting career, the Romero Troupe is kind of a labor theater. It's an all volunteer labor theater here. And we did a play called Which Side Are You On 10 years ago. And we thought we would do it once or twice. We're all volunteers. We don't have, time to put into this. And we ended up doing it for 2 years because every time we did it, the community and the shows were packed. The community would say, do it again, do it again. So we would do it again, and it went on for 2 years. So people want access to this history. They just don't have it in our school systems, unless there's a lot of great teachers who find a way to teach it. But systemically, it's not taught, and that's a problem. So I'm so happy to be here tonight, and I hope to hear from many of you. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks again, Professor Walsh. It's been really amazing. I'm so glad that we did this. We had a really good turnout, and I think we'll be getting a lot of views on YouTube and Facebook as well. So thanks, Dr. Walsh. I just dropped the link again in the chat for the feedback form. Oh, sorry, I did not do that. Okay, there it is. So this is the first seminar that we've held this year. We really appreciate any feedback that the audience has. Of course, any feedback from you, Professor Walsh. But thanks again, everyone, for attending. I did have a couple of private messages asking about how to join the union, which is awesome. You'll find all the information at ucwcolorado.org. You'll also see that information if you go to the survey link that I sent. After you provide your feedback, there'll be an option for you to join the union if you already haven't joined. So yeah, there's a direct link from Alex in the chat. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to stop talking. Appreciate you all. Thanks very much, Professor Walsh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.